Hello. Nothing reveals the darkness in human nature quite like extreme cruelty. A thirst for blood and sadism, rare even in the animal world, sometimes consumes people's minds. In such moments, one can't help but wonder, is there anything human left in a killer? Let's try to figure it out together. Murder rarely affects only the victim. Family members suffer, communities panic, and even strangers may tragically lose their lives due to a chain of terrible decisions. Today's case is no exception. Kaitlyn Lorek was born on August 9, 1953, in New Mexico, USA, into a large and loving family. She had two sisters, Loretta and Serena, and three brothers, William, Leo, and Joseph. Little is known about her early childhood. The family later relocated to California. In the 1970s, young Kathy met Jeffrey Line. Their relationship progressed quickly, and at 23, Kaitlyn married Jeffrey. Soon after, their first son, Michael, was born. 4 years later, in December 1980, Eric was born, and in August 1983, their daughter Marissa arrived. As the family grew, the relationship between the couple began to deteriorate. After 20 years of marriage, they divorced in 1997. It was a difficult process, but Kaitlyn was granted primary custody of the children. Jeffrey retained visitation rights and was required to pay child support. Despite the challenges, people described Kaitlyn as filled with a renewed will to live. She began a new chapter. By that time, her children were grown and living on their own. She resided in California and found work as an executive assistant at a tech company. Her career flourished. Kaitlyn was described as responsible, respected, and highly valued by her colleagues and leadership. She soon met Johannes Lorek, the son of one of her colleagues. He was of Austrian descent, and their connection was instant. Despite the challenges of long-distance travel and his frequent trips to Austria, they made every effort to spend time together, romantic dinners, hiking trips, and shared weekends. In early 2003, during a trip to the Swiss Alps, Johannes proposed. The only issue was that he planned to move back to Austria permanently. Kaitlyn agreed, ready to follow her future husband overseas. They married in the US, and she planned to join him in Europe after completing some work projects. During this time, Kaitlyn maintained her job at the company near the Contra Costa Canal Trail, which winds through the Concord area. The trail was a popular spot for locals to jog or bike. Kaitlyn often took walks there during her lunch breaks. She kept a pair of walking shoes at the office specifically for that purpose. Sometimes she walked alone, other times with colleagues. This was common among the employees. Lunch breaks lasted about an hour, giving them enough time to eat, relax, and even call loved ones. Kaitlyn and Johannes spoke on the phone several times a day, eagerly waiting for the day they would finally reunite. 2 months after their wedding, on what seemed like a normal workday, Kaitlyn left the office during her lunch break to walk the trail. She was planning to enjoy a bit of fresh air and talk to her husband. But what happened next changed everything. It all happened on Tuesday, May 13, 2003, at around 12:40 p.m. Several employees saw Kaitlyn leave the building and head toward the canal trail. Normally, at that time, the trail would have people around, joggers, cyclists, dog walkers. The area was populated, and it was broad daylight. But strangely, the trail seemed nearly deserted. In the distance, Kaitlyn noticed some figures disappearing down the path. She passed a few people on her way out of the building, but nothing seemed unusual. She had her trusted companion with her, Johannes, on the phone. Witnesses later recalled seeing a beautiful, cheerful woman in athletic sneakers walking onto the trail. She was talking on her mobile phone, smiling, and appeared to be in a great mood. The couple was calmly discussing future plans. Suddenly, Johannes heard a strange noise, a woman's scream, then a loud thud, and the call went dead. He immediately tried to call her back, but the phone kept going to voicemail. Worried, he contacted her office. By the time he reached her colleagues, they were already concerned. Kaitlyn had been gone too long. She followed a routine every day, especially with her lunch break walks. She was responsible and would never disappear without notifying someone. Her absence alarmed both co-workers and management. Johannes was now panicking. She wasn't in the building, so they called the police. The Concord Police Department received the call around 3 p.m. Unlike the typical delays, officers took immediate action. Within 10 minutes, they were searching the trail Kaitlyn had likely taken. A few hundred meters in, they found a blood stain on the asphalt. It included a distinct mark, something like a bicycle tire tread. The blood was smeared, and the trail led off into the nearby bushes. Following the blood trail, officers found one of Kaitlyn's sneakers around 3:30 p.m. It was covered in blood and lying in a puddle of it. A few meters farther, lying on the forest floor, they discovered her mutilated body. It was an incredibly violent scene. The attack had been savage. She could only be identified by her clothing, most of which had been torn off. The assault was suspected to be sexually motivated. Despite her horrific injuries, Kaitlyn was still barely alive. She was rushed to the nearest medical center, but doctors could do nothing. At 4:54 p.m., she was pronounced dead. The cause of death: severe traumatic brain injury. Her skull had been crushed, fractured by repeated blows with a blunt object. She was likely struck on the head, then dragged into the bushes and beaten further. The trail bore clear signs of the struggle. Even pieces of her scalp with hair were found. What enabled such a brutal crime to happen unnoticed? There were no people around at that moment, and the specific stretch of the trail was hidden behind a hill out of sight. But who could commit such a monstrous act? The police called for backup. Crime scene investigators combed the area for evidence. Detectives interviewed co-workers and local residents. Officers appealed to the public through the media, seeking any possible witnesses or leads. The city offered a $10,000 reward for information that could help solve the case. There was little progress in arresting the perpetrator during the early stages of the investigation. Only a handful of tips came in, none of which provided any useful leads. A thorough examination of the trail and the bushes, through which the victim had been dragged, yielded no additional clues. The killer appeared to be no amateur. He likely had prior experience with violent crimes and left behind no traceable evidence. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the brutality. Kaitlyn had been beaten for a prolonged period and sexually assaulted. Given her impeccable background, the senselessness of the attack was all the more disturbing. Detectives concluded it was a completely unprovoked act, which was confirmed by her husband. Everything happened so suddenly that she had no chance to react. There were no defensive wounds, indicating she likely lost consciousness after the very first blow to the head. Investigators explored every possible lead. The sheer violence of the attack led some to consider that the killer might be a serial offender. The intensity and frenzy suggested he might have been in a dissociative or rage state. An alternative theory: the attacker knew the victim personally. But who could have harbored such hatred towards such a kind and beautiful woman? Johannes was unable to provide any helpful clues. Even though the attack happened while he was speaking with her, He didn't hear any names or noises that might identify the attacker. It's likely that the moment Kaitlyn was struck in the head, the phone was knocked from her hand and turned off. About an hour into the search, forensic investigators discovered what was believed to be the murder weapon. It appeared the assailant had found it near the crime scene, where a fence made of thick metal rods ran along the trail. One of these rods had been ripped from the ground. Bloodied, it was found a few meters from the body. Kaitlyn had been savagely beaten with this steel rod, her skull shattered. Even if she had survived, the damage would have left her permanently paralyzed. Friends and relatives were at a loss. No one could think of any conflict or tension in Kaitlyn's life that could escalate to murder. With no clear suspects, detectives focused on her closest circle. They found that Kaitlyn avoided aggressive people, stayed out of trouble, and was known for being peaceful and non-confrontational. The only dark chapter in her life was her divorce from her first husband, Jeffrey Lyne, back in 1997. Everyone knew it had been a very bitter and painful separation. There were whispers that he had never truly let go of his anger toward her. News of Kaitlyn's recent marriage was said to have sparked a fit of rage in him, one he couldn't control. After the incident, the trail was closed. Even after police tape was removed, locals avoided it, afraid of what had happened there. All the employees from Kaitlyn's office stopped using the path during lunch breaks, fearing a killer might still be out there. Johannes was quickly cleared as a suspect. He was physically far away at the time of the murder, and phone records confirmed his location and the call with Kaitlyn. Police also questioned Jeffrey Lyne, her ex-husband. He had a solid alibi which was verified. Detectives briefly explored whether either man could have hired a killer, but that theory led nowhere and was considered highly unlikely from the start. Both men were eliminated as suspects within hours of the police being called. The area surrounding the body had been painstakingly combed for evidence. But then detectives realized one critical item was missing. If Kaitlyn was on the phone during the attack, where was her mobile phone? Investigators suspected the killer had taken it with him. As soon as they attempted to ping the signal, they discovered that the phone had remained nearby. In a residential complex located just 5 minutes from the forest where the body had been found, police quickly obtained a search warrant for the entire apartment building. When officers knocked on one door, a 20-year-old man named Juan Sanchez answered. After some hesitation, he admitted he had Kaitlyn's mobile phone. At first, it seemed the young man could be the killer, but he denied any involvement and told police he had found the phone while riding his bike that day. He claimed he had been returning from a store when he came across the abandoned phone. There was no one else around, so he assumed he could keep it. Juan then took officers to the location where he said he had found the device. It was about 50 meters away from the bloody trail detectives had already discovered. His story sounded plausible, but the authorities decided to verify it thoroughly and collected his DNA for analysis. Since Kaitlyn Lorick had been raped, investigators had obtained a biological profile of the perpetrator using fluids collected from her body. This all happened well before modern DNA testing technologies, so the comparison process took time. Once the profile was completed, it was checked against the national database, which contained around 6 million entries at the time. Unfortunately, no match was found, and Juan's DNA did not match the samples taken from the crime scene. With that, the investigation once again reached a dead end. While police were left shrugging their shoulders, panic began to grip the local community. No one felt safe knowing that a person capable of crushing someone's skull with a steel rod in broad daylight was still at large. Detectives believed there may have been someone in Kaitlyn's life who had pursued her romantically and was angered by her recent marriage, perhaps even driven to violence. This theory was the only plausible lead at that point. One of her co-workers told investigators that shortly before Kaitlyn met her future husband, she had a brief long-distance relationship with a young man from Germany. According to one of her friends, Kaitlyn was supposed to meet him in person just days before the attack. It seemed she wanted to explain in person that she was now married and that a relationship between them was no longer possible. Naturally, she meant well, but not everyone handles rejection gracefully. This could have triggered the attack. Authorities began to investigate this single lead, but were unable to confirm any meeting or even contact with the German man. Their communication appeared to have ceased entirely after Kaitlyn met Johannes. While speaking to people who had been on the trail that tragic day, detectives discovered something curious. Shortly before the attack, a suspicious man had been seen in the area, acting strangely. One woman said he had tried to lure her into the bushes, claiming he had something to show her. To another passing man, he said he was fishing in the pond. All of these witnesses worked with a police sketch artist, and 2 composite sketches were created from their accounts, independent of each other. Despite being based on separate witness statements, the sketches showed striking similarities, which gave authorities confidence that they had a realistic image of the suspect. By this time, the reward for information leading to an arrest had been increased to $35,000. $25,000 of which was newly offered by Kaitlyn's employer. As is often the case, this resulted in a flood of tips, the majority of which turned out to be unrelated to the case. A press conference was held too. At a press conference, the oldest son of the victim, 6-year-old Michael, made a heartfelt appeal to the public, asking for help in finding his mother's killer. The composite sketches of the suspected perpetrator were shown to the public. At the same time, detectives began comparing the drawings to entries in the criminal database, focusing on individuals with a history of sexual assaults or other violent offenses. Based on the psychological profile, it seemed the killer was an experienced offender who had likely committed violent acts in the past. Eventually, detectives came to believe the composite sketch matched a photo of a man named John Kabalovka. A tracking dog was brought in and led officers in the direction of John's home, but the trail ended at a highway. Just 3 days after the murder, on May 16, 2003, police were already knocking on the suspect's door. But instead of John, they were met by a frightened, fragile woman, his 30-year-old sister, Elizabeth. She told the officers they had arrived too late. On May 14th, shortly after the press conference and the release of new sketches, John had gone to the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco and jumped to his death. Detectives believed this was no coincidence. The suspect had chosen to end his life after committing what was likely the most brutal and senseless crime in the area's history. A search warrant was issued for John's last known residence, and what police found only seemed to confirm their worst fears. They discovered bloody clothing that matched witness descriptions of what the man seen near the trail was wearing on the day of the attack. John had also been collecting newspaper clippings about the case, a behavior often observed in killers. In addition, he had cut out the composite sketch made by the forensic artist, one that bore a strong resemblance to himself. However, John's prior offenses had been relatively minor. Most were limited to DUIs, driving under the influence. He had been arrested 4 times in the last 10 years. In 1987, he had made death threats against his mother, a judge, and the court itself. Although these were disturbing, they seemed nowhere near the level of brutality involved in Kaitlyn's murder, which shocked everyone. It was also believed that John's mental health issues had made him especially dangerous. His parents were interviewed, and his father sharply criticized the police, calling their efforts to connect his son to the murder a disgrace and an attempt to smear the name of a mentally ill man. Still, there was one guaranteed way to either confirm or refute the suspicions. The police needed John's DNA. All the witnesses who had helped create the composite sketch were shown photographs of John, and every single one identified him as the strange, unsettling man they had seen on the trail. Rumors began to spread, and media coverage exploded. John's father was so furious in defending his son's innocence that the authorities were forced to hold another press conference, during which they admitted that they could not definitively state John's guilt until the DNA test results were finalized. This statement reignited public fear, as it meant the real killer might still be free. Upon reviewing John's past, the authorities reaffirmed their suspicions. For DUI arrests over a decade and serious threats made in 1987, this did not seem like a case of mistaken identity. But when the DNA test results finally came back, they stunned everyone. John was not the man who raped and murdered Kaitlyn. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. After all the media attacks and accusations, John's family demanded a public apology. They believed the ordeal had severely damaged their lives, and rightfully so. John's decision to take his own life was influenced in part by the media's publication of sketches that closely resembled him. His father wanted to push for changes in legislation to protect the families of suspects in crimes when irrefutable evidence has not yet been presented. Despite the pain they had suffered, John's family understood what Kaitlyn's loved ones were going through. They even offered a $5,000 reward for any information that could lead to the arrest of the real killer. This amount was added to the existing reward, raising the total to $40,000. But it did little to advance the case. Detectives continued their investigation. DNA samples were taken from at least 5 different men, but none matched. Then, about 4 months after the murder, an older witness came forward. He had briefly interacted with a suspicious man near a canal shortly before the attack. The man had a bicycle, stood in an unusual spot, and seemed nervous and watchful. They had a short conversation and smoked cigarettes together before parting ways. Police asked the witness to take them to the exact spot, hoping to find a cigarette but that might contain the suspect's DNA. Amazingly, among several discarded cigarette butts, one was found that matched the DNA on Kaitlyn's body. The witness was interviewed again and shared more details. He hadn't known the man's name but learned during their chat that he worked at a telemarketing company in Walnut Creek, about 15 minutes from the trail. There was only one such company in that area. Detectives visited the office with nothing but composite sketches and a vague idea. While reviewing employee photos, several co-workers immediately identified a 38-year-old man named Robert Fraser. Shockingly, Robert looked almost identical to John, enough that they could have been mistaken for brothers. Suspiciously, Robert had stopped showing up to work right after the murder. Detectives tracked his last known address and went to his apartment, but he had already moved out a few weeks earlier. His former partner couldn't say where he had gone, but she provided his toothbrush so they could obtain a DNA sample. As they waited for the results, a call came from a sheriff's office in Indiana. Robert had been arrested on an unrelated charge while trying to return to his hometown. Before moving to California, Robert had been on probation in Indiana and had violated its terms, making him a wanted man in another state. Police interviewed him. Robert admitted to living near the trail where Kaitlyn was killed, but denied any involvement in her murder. However, he was lying. The DNA results came back and they matched. When told about the DNA evidence, Robert gave a bizarre explanation. He claimed that he had walked along the trail while drunk, needed to urinate, and may have done so on the body by accident, not realizing it was there. Of course, this didn't explain how his semen was found inside Kaitlyn. This attempt to mislead investigators was both absurd and offensive. The DNA evidence was conclusive, and Robert was arrested and charged with first-degree rape and murder. The charges could result in the death penalty, though his defense hoped to obtain life imprisonment without parole. In May 2006, Robert Fraser stood trial. He showed no emotion and refused to admit guilt. His lawyers tried everything to lessen the sentence, while the prosecution simply laid out the brutal, lust-driven facts. Even without dramatization, the case horrified the jury. The trial lasted an entire month. Robert was found guilty on all counts. As a last resort, his attorneys described his tragic childhood. The son of addicted parents, exposed to abuse and trauma from a young age. They argued that these experiences shaped him into a monster. But the prosecutor insisted that a difficult upbringing was no excuse for such savage cruelty. Ultimately, the jury decided that Robert deserved the death penalty. Only then did Robert show any emotion, lashing out and accusing everyone of bias. Today, he remains on death row, awaiting execution, and continues to deny his guilt. Yes, stories like this are terrifying, but don't lose hope. Now that you know what some people are capable of, stay alert and stay safe. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever encountered anything like this in your life? Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Friday the 13th.